Well, for this video, I would like to do a libertarian review of, this is the last book, but really the whole series. There's two reasons I want to do a libertarian review rather than a normal review. The first is a good reason, and that is that I don't really read very much fiction, and so I would not be a good judge of a book in those terms. I don't read for entertainment very often. I usually read for information. I have friends who do read for entertainment, and they always impress me by how much they read. I had a friend in high school who would consistently read anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 pages a week. The last bookstore I went to, I noted how few texts there were about, say, history or science compared to how many novels there were, either romance or science fiction or whatever. And after chatting with the owner of the store for a while, he said, yeah, some people read for entertainment and they read a whole lot, and that's not me. I'll make exceptions and read fiction when I think that it's important enough, basically, that I would understand culture better if I read it. So Lord of the Rings in 1984, War and Peace and Dune, and over the years, if I added them all up, there'd be a few, but nothing like most of my books are history books, economics books, that sort of thing. And I wasn't too interested in the Game of Thrones. I saw when it first came out on HBO, there was a lot of hype around it. I tried to watch it, and I didn't really get into it that much, other than I was impressed by how complicated the plot and the characters seemed to be. Then a number of my friends were big fans of the book. In particular, all of my Icelandic libertarian friends loved the book. Even before Season 2 was filmed in Iceland, they loved the book. And then Kadioteka, he told me he really liked the book. And when HBO came out with a new promo, a new preview for the second season, which is now almost over, I just decided, hey, what the hell. I bought all 5 of them, and I just now finished the 5th one that he's written. And I wish... when I started, I was kind of hoping that, well, by the time I finish, maybe he'll have the 6th book ready. But actually, it looks like it's probably going to be 2 or 3 more years, and who knows. And that is one thing I've never wanted to be in a position where I am waiting for something that's going to take years and years. I specifically never read Harry Potter because I was worried that I'd end up waiting for that last book. I guess that excuse is gone, but whatever. So that's the main reason, though, that I'm not going to do a basic review, is because I don't read enough fiction. I've noticed that people who do read a lot of fiction, they have a much more refined view of the matter, which makes perfect sense. And there's also a tendency for them to sometimes rate really popular works less than people who don't read as much, probably because they're just exposed to so much more. But the other reason is that just I'm more interested in libertarianism anyway, so that would be my my main contribution to this. Now, I don't think that you could say that there's any evidence that is that his name? That George Martin is particularly libertarian. However, within the book, he does show a degree of understanding of economics and their workings in the real world, and in the incentive structures in politics. I don't want to say want to say he's more attuned to that than in other fiction, because, like I said, I don't read a lot of fiction. But within other media, like on television or on movies, he seems to know quite a bit more. There's a lot of interesting little tidbits. At one point, Daenerys Stormborn, the Dragon Queen, starts freeing lots of slaves, and there become labor disputes because there are guilds who basically say, well, they're pushing down wages, and so they want to have her enforce basically wage and price controls, to enforce guilds or unions to keep prices high. There's a lot about price inflation, or when the demand goes up, like if the city's being besieged, or the start of winter where prices go up. Let's see, there was a part where Queen Cersei owed a large debt to the religious orders, and they asked that she asked what she could do to make them basically forgive the debt, and they said that if she allowed them to reestablish several militant religious orders that had existed in the past, that they'd be willing to forgive it. And that is something that happened in Christianity. The Catholic Church used to have military orders like the Knights. Well, the most famous ones is the Knights Templar, but the Knights Hospitaller, and there are a whole bunch of other ones. But it actually reminded me of the book I was reading concurrently, which is this book, Devil's Game. It's about the U.S. government subsidizing radical Islam, not because they're secretly hoping to instigate radical Islam, but because they're so short-sighted that they are willing to pay for that, to subsidize something that could come around and hurt them. And in the book, that happens actually almost too quickly to be believed. She lets these religious orders establish basically militias, religious militias, and very soon thereafter, she's actually imprisoned by those same guards. Another thing that you notice is that the government's always in debt. The government's always spending money. The government's always spending money on war. It's always thinking in the very short term. It's always thinking about postponing its debts, about borrowing more in the here and now. And at one point, they borrow a lot of money from a foreign bank called the Iron Bank of Bravos. Bravos is a city across the sea, very much kind of fashioned on an Italian city-state. And it's right out of all the conspiracy theories that you ever hear about, the bankers or the Rothschilds, where there's a section in the book where he says the Iron Bank of Bravos always gets its due, because if you renege on a loan, then they'll simply provide financial support to anybody who is against you. So in the book, there's several contenders for the throne. When the Lannisters and Cersei basically tell the Bank of Bravos to get lost, they go and start funding them. They start funding other mercenary groups. I don't know how accurate that really is. I don't know if the banks are that proactive, other than they do profit either way. But that was interesting. But I think the most important kind of relevant contribution here is the idea that the state and the people in the government, in Westeros, in George Martin's book, and in real life, it doesn't exist to help the populace. It exists for their own benefit. The Lannisters and all the people in Casterly Rock and all the people in King's Landing that work in the government bureaucracy, and all the orders and guilds that are supported by the government bureaucracy, they exist. The government exists so that they can live very good and wealthy lives, that they can be powerful, that they can live without want, that they can be guaranteed sustenance. In this case, it is an overtly feudal society, very, very much inspired by, if not explicitly, technically in every way, related to European feudalism. And in that situation, you have a certain class of people, the lords and the knights, and of course the king and all of them as well, who are just have a right to land, have a right to the products of the labor of other people, and they're just entitled to that. And there is a cover story, so to speak, a kind of justification as to why everyone should accept these lords and knights lording over them. And the reason is this kind of chivalry code, this idea that, well, the king is there to protect the people or to give peace to the land, and that we need there to be this class above us, or else we would there'd be chaos and death, and everything would be terrible. And if we look in history, there is the so-called divine right of kings. There are basically these justifications for monarchies in the past that today we don't consider to be convincing at all, but held sway for thousands of years. And it's clear, you know, when the Pharaoh or the King of England, or even though that's not ancient history, I suppose, still, says that they have a right to be king because otherwise the nation will die or suffer tremendously. We can look at that and say it's pretty obvious that they just want to have an easy life, have power. I mean, actually, it wouldn't be so bad if they just wanted an easy life, and some of them, that's all they want. But some of them want more than that. They want power, they want glory. There's nothing wrong with wanting glory, but they want to win that glory with the blood of innocent people, by killing innocent people and by using others as mostly as soldiers, but also as, you know, slave architects or builders or whatever. And that's pretty bad. And we would recognize that as being silly, but we still have today the same thing. It's just, instead of a monarchy, it's just a government that cloaks itself in something called democracy, a political philosophy that's more or less referred to as democracy as opposed to chivalry or monarchy. And the incentives aren't identical. It's not hereditary per se, although there seems to be a lot of that. I mean, what are the odds that 2 Bushes become president, 2 Adams become president, that Bill and Hillary Clinton would both be, you know, obviously there's a group of people who are on the in. It's not exclusive to them. There are, I think, outsiders who can get into the government. I think that is true. It's not, you know, it's sort of an Horatio Alger kind of story where it doesn't happen to most people. It doesn't happen to principled people ever. People who are able to weasel their way in are those who have managed to do so because they are exceedingly cunning and good at lying and good at offering services to the power elite. Anyway, in the book, the suffering of the poor and of the disenfranchised, of the non-ruling class is really one of the common features in the book. And they even explicitly talk about how, you know, when there's a war, because a lot of the book takes place in the course of the Civil War, and in the areas where most of the battles fight are completely destroyed. All the fields are burned. An enemy will come and they'll kill everyone in the village they can find. And a couple weeks later, when the other side comes through, they'll kill everyone that they can find and steal anything that hadn't been killed yet. And they remark how, well, if a lord gets captured, they'll get ransomed, they'll get sent back, or they'll get exchanged. If a regular peasant, they'll just be killed, they'll just be, you know, chopped to pieces. And the ruling elite in the books, they don't go around all day thinking, what do we need to do to help the common people? We're here to protect the common people. What are we going to have to do to make their lives better, to help protect them from whatever? All they think about is how to make themselves more powerful, how to make themselves richer, how to make themselves appear more grandiose, how to sate their own vanity, basically. Now, to an extent, sometimes that mandates that they take some consideration to people. So, Joffrey is a bastard in this. He's the king. Actually, the twin brother of his mother is actually his father, but that's not known. And they make a point of pretending that, of not admitting that he's a bastard and that he's not actually descended from the king, which is the basis of his power. And that is an example of them saying, well, we got to appeal to the common, because if we don't, then our legitimacy will be gone. But it's not because they give a shit about what the common people think. They have nothing but contempt for the common people. They just have an awareness that they're outnumbered, and so they have to tell them something. The knights are basically rapers and thieves and thugs, by and large. There is a code of conduct that they put aside whenever is in their interest. Whenever their private interests are juxtaposed against the rhetoric of chivalry, they always choose the former. This is how you can judge whether governments really are doing what people think. You know, people say, well, look, they defend us, they build fortresses around Washington, or they build a navy or whatever. Well, if the interests of the state and the interests of the people coincide to some degree, then you can't use actions in that area as proof that this government is there to help people, because it's only serving its own ends. You know, if aircraft carriers, for instance, really make everybody safe, but they also make the government safe, and the government builds aircraft carriers, then that doesn't mean the government is doing anything to help people. The government's building aircraft carriers to help itself, and that any benefit that gives to other people is just ancillary. Although, in fact, aircraft carriers don't really help us at all. But the test is what does the government do when its interests are opposed to those of the people? What does it do then? And it will choose, or the people within the government will choose its own interest over the stated rhetorical ends of protecting the people very systematically. And this happens in the book. And actually, the one institution that actually exists to defend the people and does not engage in these politics is the Night's Watch, is an organization that's stuck in the north, protecting the realm from a threat that, although so far is rather vague, is clearly much more threatening than anything else on the horizon. And yet, what is the opinion of the ruling elites of the Night's Watch? It's not one. It's one of absolute derision. They don't give them anything but the scum of the earth. There's no honor in it. None of them aspire to it. You know, if this public-spirited, if the people in the government in the government were so public-spirited in Westeros, that would mean they would all want to be in the Night's Watch, because that's the thing that defends the people the most. And there are occasionally people like that. Most of the people there were condemned for crimes, or they were like the second or third son who was not like to inherit anything, or something like that. Somebody who was there because all their better options were denied them. Occasionally, somebody who really has better things going for them will decide to do it, but it's very, very rare. But most of the people in government, what do they want to be? They want to play the Game of Thrones. They don't want to defend the realm. They want to be king or have influence or have power. Or if they're a lord and they don't really aspire to be king, they want to have more lands. They look at all their neighbors and they think, I should have all that stuff. I should just own it. I have a right to have. They don't think, how do I protect my people? How do I serve them? That's not how they think. The few who do, and there are examples of this, it would almost be better if they didn't exist. There is a knight, for instance, named Barristan Selmy. If you've seen the show, he's in the first season. He's in the King's Guard. He never fights. He talks to Eddard Stark at one point. And he's dismissed. And he's dismissed because he's actually a very principled guy. He's an honorable guy. He takes his vows very seriously. He does think that as a knight he's supposed to protect the weak. In the books, on a couple of occasions, you know, he's in political intrigues where they say, well, we need to kill the hostages or we need to take prisoners. He says, no, we don't kill children. We don't do those things. And so he's an upstanding person. So is someone like Eddard Stark. But these are exceptional people. And what do they get from it is they get banished, they get beheaded in the case of Eddard Stark. And at some point, Barristan Selmy, he was a bodyguard for the Targaryens before Robert Baratheon became the king. And the last Targaryen king was crazy. And he was a horrible person who would burn people to death. And this man, this honorable man, would guard him and protect him, and he rescued him at one point. At one point he was taken captive, and this knight went, and this is like the good public school teacher, the good bureaucrat. You know, the person who actually has the will to help others and not just their own self-interest, which there's nothing wrong with that, but like who their self-interest they perceive as helping others, and they actually have principles and a code, and they actually believe in something, and they're hard workers, and they're capable. Those people exist. And where do they get in the bureaucracy? They don't get anywhere. They end up on the wall. Forsaken. The public school teacher, and I don't want to say that they're all like this, but there's some, and they're just stuck in a bureaucracy. Or the soldier. There's lots of soldiers, I'm sure, who think that they're defending this country, but they are just a slave to the political whims of the state. And they're off doing things that have nothing to do with the safety of the United States or the American people or anything of the like. In fact, what they do is positively against those interests. And these good bureaucrats, so to speak, they don't do any good, but they do give they make the rest of the government look good. So even though almost all knights are rapers and robbers and wouldn't lift a finger to help a common person, and they think of common people as scum and beneath them, the common people will point to someone like Barristan Selmy and be like, he's Barristan the Bold. He is a good knight. And they will imagine that that's how the system is, when that's not how the system is. The system is full of people who have, the overlord government has absolutely nothing but contempt for the underlings beneath them. And that's exactly how it is in real life. So the government, even in cases where you might plausibly say this is a function that needs to be done, like defense. We all need defense, one degree or another. So that's a function that ostensibly government should do, or could conceivably be done, in the sense that it needs to happen. But nobody in government looks at it. The people in our government don't get together and be like, how are we going to make sure the American people are safe today? We keep hearing that people get murdered all the time in America. What are we going to do to stop that? They don't ever say this. Maybe some people in the military get together and talk about what are we going to do if China attacks us. But at the end of the day, they work for political overlords who don't think about that and who would just assume if they thought it was going to serve their interests, they would sell us to China or us or some part of the U.S. or whatever. Or whatever they thought would be best for them, then that's what's going to happen. Not what the good bureaucrats have been planning all along. That's not going to be what happens. And so yes, the Night Watch, which is actually, it could be debatable whether the Night's Watch is even part of the government. It doesn't have taxing power. It doesn't have royal authority. It has basically land. It has private property that's owned by it. And it basically lives off of donations from the rest of society. Actually providing. But the view of the state is the Night's Watch is a joke. It's not. They're not even thinking about that. The only time that it ever happens is when Stannis comes to the rescue. If I'm not... Spoiler alert, sorry. And that's actually an example of someone convinced. Stannis is Robert Baratheon's younger brother, who would have a right to the throne supposedly because Robert's sons are actually not his sons. And at one point, he's basically losing the war. Oh, this brings me to another point I'm going to get to. He's losing the war, and his hand, who is a smuggler, tells him that he should go and defend the wall because that's really what a king ought to do, and he does. That's very unusual. But the thing I was going to remember, the legitimacy of the government here, again, is shown to be very, very precarious. The right of these kings is hereditary, but everybody knows, Robert Baratheon was not born a king. He became a king because he killed the previous heir. He killed Rhaegar, who would have been the king, and then Jaime Lannister killed the actual king. Robert basically won by conquest. But if we go back further, even the kings that he displaced, the Targaryens, they won the crown by conquest. They flew in with a couple dragons, and they took over Westeros 300 years before the events in these books. And everybody knows it. And so there's no intrinsicness about them other than conquest. Their right is from the sword, and that's it. Now there are all these pleasantries about how it's okay and how it's... That's where it really comes from, and everybody knows it. And another, this is kind of on the side, there's a very interesting passage. One of the most interesting passages I thought in the entire series in Clash of Kings. It's already been shown on HBO, although HBO is doing a great job, but they have to cut a lot of corners. There is a scene early in Clash of Kings when Catelyn Stark, Eddard Stark's wife, goes to meet with Renly. Renly is the youngest of Robert Baratheon's brother. Robert Baratheon was the king. He had two younger brothers, Stannis and Renly. Renly, who in the show is depicted as gay. In the books, he is a sort of implied gay a few times. I don't think it's ever stated. I was looking for it. I didn't see it anymore. Anyway, both of them decide they want to be king. And Stannis is a soldier. He's very iron-willed, but nobody likes him. And so at first, he only has a very small force. He only has the lands that Robert had given him and a few others. He had money. He was able to hire some mercenary pirates, but he had a very small force. Renly basically moved into the south, which is the most populous area. He had all of his retainers, the people who were underneath him, and then he married into one of the wealthiest, most powerful families, and he very quickly amassed what was probably the largest army in the conflict up to that point. And they all swore allegiance to him, and it was just a big deal. And Stannis besieged one of Renly's strongholds, a fortress called Storm's End. And so Renly, obviously went to fight his brother Stannis. So you have a fortress, and you have Stannis besieging it, and then you have Renly with a much more powerful army surrounding Stannis. And they have a parlay, they talk, and basically they can't agree. And I mean, Stannis says, "I'm your older brother, you have to do what I say," and Renly says, "No one really cares about that, obviously. I have 100,000 soldiers who say that I'm the one who's supposed to be king. You have 10,000 soldiers who say you're the one who's supposed to be king. Tomorrow we're going to find out." And that night, Renly is murdered in the tent by magic. In the book, it's actually a lot cooler, I thought, than in the show, but the show does fine too. And he's murdered in his tent, with Brienne of Tarth and Catelyn Stark being the only two witnesses. As soon as he's murdered, his guards kind of rush in because they hear the commotion. They don't know what's going on. And basically, the really interesting scene is when Catelyn and Brienne are leaving the camp. And as they leave the camp, this is like the day before this army is going to annihilate Stannis. It's much more powerful. Everyone knows Renly's force is more powerful than Stannis' force. As they leave, the camp is going into commotion. Alarms are going, people are blowing horns. And, Catelyn sees all the banners waving. She realizes, look, their entire ideology was they have to have a king. And they had picked Renly as their king. And Renly just died. And so they ideologically, they still need a king. Now, physically, they have the larger army. They could destroy Stannis. Renly is not going to be the difference between them winning or losing a battle. He's not a great general. He's not a great fighter. But ideologically, they needed a king. And so, if your king is Renly Baratheon, then who's your next king is going to be his older brother. And at one point she says, they don't know it yet, but all these people are going to be Stannis's. And that's exactly what happens. A few of them leave. Renly's gay lover and his family leave. But most of the rest, they go from hating and ready to kill Stannis to becoming his soldiers. And all of a sudden, Stannis becomes the most powerful person in Westeros for a time. And what I thought was interesting about that is all this aggregated power that the state has, and people who are statists love and want there to be that power. It just takes one. We don't have kings, but it takes one political leader, one shift in the wind, and all that stuff that you think is there for good, it can just totally polarize and switch to be against you. And we can use examples like here. All those people who loved Bush and thought it was great that he had all these Patriot Act powers and NDAA and all this bullshit police state stuff, all this carte blanche to fight wars, all the people who thought that was great. Well, he lost an election, and now Obama, somebody that those people revile as evil, even the Antichrist, all that power is his now. It just, overnight, it became his. And it's happened, of course, in monarchy many times. I mean, I'm not even going to say the even more obvious examples, but it's so clear that the physical power there need not be attached that way. It is an ideological trap that makes it the way that it is. And it's not a necessary one. Oh, and so this brings me to, I think someone had posted, what about the free folk? North of the wall, there is an explicitly anarchist society. The wildlings, also called the free folk. They don't bend the knee. They don't have lords. They have people who they consider their leaders, but they have no obligation to obey them. If they don't like what their leaders say, they just get new leaders, or they just ignore them and do their own things. In the book, they are explicitly stated it's a very rough and tumble kind of area. There's a lot of violence, but also it's stated that people like that, and that people will come to take it. Ygritte, who is a woman, she's shown up in the show as a red-haired woman who Jon Snow kind of meets with. she's the wall character for the North to Jon. She's the one who explains the North and the wildlings to Jon, and to us basically, not to Jon, to us. And she says it's a hard life. There's no protection. You have to watch out for yourself. You're responsible for yourself. You could get murdered. You could cause murder. But most men come to like the taste of it. She says something to that effect. And that was pretty interesting. I don't think it was an explicit endorsement of anarchy. I just think it was perhaps an acknowledgement that it's not necessarily all bad. That there might be something to be said for it. And all this kneeling, because right as it is right now, all the power of the South, which is many orders of magnitude more powerful than the wildlings, is that all that power, none of it is being used for defense. All the armies that, the Florents and the Lannisters and even the Starks and the Baratheons that they're raising, all that power, none of it is being used for what's important. None of it is being used for actual defense. None. And so the fact that it's more powerful is irrelevant. The fact that we have $1 trillion military is irrelevant because it's not providing us with defense. And so I don't think that these books are explicitly libertarian. I think that for books to be, even fiction, for them to be really meaningful, they have to have a pretty good beat on reality, which reality is that the state's not all that, kings protecting the land, knight on shining armor kind of stuff. And of course, the books reflect that very well. So I enjoyed them quite a bit. I'm sad that I'm going to have to wait a couple years to find out that Jon Snow is really Rhaegar's son. But I guess I'll be willing to see what happens. I don't expect there to be a libertarian utopia at the end, but one never knows. It's pretty sophisticated, I thought. I enjoyed it, and the lessons it teaches us about feudalism and kings and stuff are just as applicable in our modern society as they are in this fictional one. So that's it.